Hey everybody, we're going to do a little notes here via video on chapter 24, the origin of species. Hopefully this is going to go well because earlier today I spent time doing one of these. Actually, it took me 2 tries and I got it all recorded and then there was no screen. So that made my heart very sad. So what this whole unit is talking about is more about speciation. Sorry, this chapter. The last chapter was also about speciation, and this one goes into even more details. Remember, we had already talked about the fact that microevolution is just a change in the allele population or the allele frequency over time. And this is just small changes in alleles like skin color, hair color, whether or not you can roll your tongue, freckles, just little tiny characteristics. But now we're also going to look at macroevolution, which is going to talk about making a whole new species. Micro, small changes, just a little bit. They're still the same species. Macro means big, so macroevolution, we're going to change enough to make the 2 organisms no longer the same species. So species, it's just a group of individuals that can interbreed, but the real kicker is that they can produce viable, fertile offspring. If you are the same species, you can produce viable, fertile offspring. They can't breed successfully with other species, only within their own species. So gene flow between different populations can keep your species together. Let's say we have a population of humans here in America and we have a population of humans in Jamaica. And because gene flow is going back and forth between those, we are staying the same species. As long as we're moving all over this planet, we Homo sapiens will stay the same species and not become so different that we can't interbreed with each other anymore. So here you can see similarities within a species. Those 2 birds look alike, and we can see differences in a species, obviously, looking at skin and hair color. So what happens here, what really becomes the problem, is the fact that they can no longer reproduce. So this is reproductive isolation. When species come together, they cannot. It impedes, it prevents them from being able to produce viable, fertile offspring. When you do have 2 different species or 2 different organisms coming together, we end up producing something called a hybrid, and that's a cross between different species. We make hybrids all the time right now. We have labradoodles and golden doodles and all sorts of different blends of dog. But because they're still Canis familiaris, which is the scientific name of dogs, they're still the same species. So we're kind of using that hybrid classification wrong. So here are a couple of different ways we can make this reproductive isolation happen. The first one is prezygotic barriers. In prezygotic barriers, this is happening before the zygote, before the baby is formed. This is something that is going to prevent a baby from being born. We're going to look at habitat isolation, temporal isolation, behavioral isolation, mechanical isolation, and gametic isolation. And then we will look at post-zygotic barriers. Post-zygotic barriers are going to be after the baby is born, and why this particular organism is not going to be successful in the future. So let's check these out. This is what I just told you. Prezygotic barriers block fertilization. It's going to impede mating, prevent successful mating, and hinder fertilization if they do mate. So we're not going to make a baby. So let's look at these pre-zygotic barriers. Habitat isolation. In this first example here, we have two different species of garter snakes. Remember, garter snakes are the ones that are in your backyard, and they're not going to hurt you. You should not freak out. You should not kill them. These guys are actually, they eat little rodents that are running around your yard, so not something to be afraid of. But these guys are working their way to becoming different species, because right now the one on the top lives in water and the one on the bottom lives on land. So the longer you're apart from each other, if they never go to the other ecosystem again, over time, we will end up with two different species. Temporal isolation is another pre-zygotic barrier. Temporal is referring to time, and this skunk here happens to mate in the spring, and this one mates in the summer. So you've got two different time periods where these guys mate, and in a lot of animal species, they're only mating one time per year. We're going to look at that a little bit more in a second. And then we have behavioral isolation. They're trying to mate, but they don't have the right cues. This picture here is a blue-footed booby. I love that bird name. They have really cool feet. And they have a particular mating ritual that they have to do, including, if you can kind of see, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but in picture E, that male booby is putting his foot up in the air to try to say, look at how pretty my feet are, trying to impress the lady. So let's look at some more examples of this. Well, habitat isolation I had already talked about with these two living in different areas. Temporal isolation, we see this here in Missouri. If you guys remember, a little while ago, a few years ago now, we had the largest, grossest cicada problem in the world. Do you guys remember 2011? The largest periodical cicada brood in Missouri came out, brood 19. Huge numbers. If you remember, I remember being in the backyard with my daughters, and I couldn't even hear them from across the yard because there were so many cicadas out there. Brood 19 is a big one, and every time brood 19 comes, it causes problems. So if you look here, we only have 4 more years till it comes back again. But there are all these other broods. Brood is just the group of the organism. Brood 19, the one that came out in 2011, is a 13-year cicada. There's another one, brood 23, that's a 13-year cicada. We have some that are 17-year cicadas. What that means is they are sitting underground, just burrowing and eating for 13 years or 17 years or however long it will be. And then after the 13 years or the 17 years, whenever their time is, they'll come back up onto land. They'll hatch, they'll mate. They stick around for a couple of weeks, mating, laying eggs, and dying. Imagine your whole life is spent underground and you only get to come up for a week or two to mate, and then you die. Very sad. When I first moved to St. Louis, a very horrible thing was happening. 1998. This was when our brood 19, the same one that came out in 2011, and another one called brood 4 came out at the same time. So help me, it looked like some sort of biblical plague. I can still remember just looking across, an area outside, and all you could see was bugs. It was absolutely disgusting. So temporal isolation, if the one group only comes up every 17 years and the other group comes up every 13 years, how often are they even going to be up at the same time? They're not going to be able to mate. In 1998, that happened, and it hadn't happened prior to that since 1977. So fortunately for you, you won't have to live through one of those, because it's going to be several hundred years before it happens again. Oh, it was traumatic, but 2024, we're back again, baby. We are back to the gross cicadas. Behavioral isolation, this is borderline appropriate, but I thought it was funny. Behavioral isolation, this is going to be when you have courtship rituals that are not okay with other groups. here's this nice young man, and he comes up to a girl and says, "Yo, shorty, want to procreate?" And look at where he is putting his hands. That is not appropriate. No, 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 we don't do that. And she says, "Oh, hell no, your mating ritual is whack. Talk about behavioral isolation." See, she doesn't like that he was doing that to her. So now his chances of mating have definitely fallen. If you do not have the right mating rituals, nice little dinner, movie, I don't know, something, you ain't going to be able to mate. Don't you guys miss my fun cartoons? All right, so more pre-zygotic barriers. Mechanical isolation. That sounds interesting. Mechanical. What does that mean? That means some parts ain't gonna work, friends. In some situations, it could be literally a shape difference that prevents successful completion of mating. If a organism is born with a sexual organ that is not in appropriate size or does not fit in a manner that would allow for mating to occur, then eventually this could lead to a separation of species because those two individuals are not going to be able to mate. And then we have gametic isolation. This one is where the sperm of one species might not be able to fertilize the egg of another species. So I don't know if you guys realize this, but in the vaginal tract of a woman, it is acidic because that's a way for the woman's body and humans to keep bacteria and yeast and other things in check by having kind of a not as hospitable environment for them to thrive in. So if a man's sperm could not handle that acidic environment, then he would not be able to mate with her. He would mechanically be able to mate with her, but we would not end up with any babies because the sperm would all die. Now the post-zygotic barriers, this is where we're going to have a problem with the hybrid zygote. There's going to be some reason why it's not real great. So if you look here, the very first one is something called reduced hybrid viability. What this means is these species have become so different from each other that now their hybrid is not good in either environment. So I'm going to try this and I hope to God that it does not kill me again. But when I try to switch screens, it causes problems. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And instead, I want to go over her. And I'm going to come back over here. Try this again. Oh, so hard to do this stuff. I'm going to figure it out. I have faith in myself. Let's see. Hopefully this is working. If not, I'm going to cry. You don't want to see it. It's not good. It's ugly. Ugly tears. Where did you go? I got a lot of screens open. This could be part of my problem. Why don't things work, Mrs. Berger? Because you have 8,562 different screens open, and your computer doesn't like that. Ah, here we go. All right, it's only 3 minutes, and I'm afraid that if I make you guys watch this on your own, that you're not going to watch it. All right, ready? All right, let's stop that share. See if we can do this. Now I got found a PowerPoint because, you know, oh, there we are. All right, so now that talked about this reduced hybrid viability. Here we've got this little guy, and in this species we had some that ended up surviving because of mimicry. One of the salamanders was born with a mutation that gave him skin that was bright colored, and that, you know, that could be good, that could be bad, because it's a bright color, so that might attract predators. But in this case, it was a bright color and it scared the predators away because they thought it was something poisonous. So it wasn't something they chose, it was something that they were born with, and it worked out to their advantage. So that kept getting carried down the Pacific coast of California. Then on the other side, you had the camouflage, or vice versa, I can't remember. And when you got all the way down to the bottom, they were so different from each other that when you had the two come together and make a baby, their hybrid was not adapted for either place. So they are going to die out, and that is going to cause a post-zygotic problem. Another thing, you've heard this story many, many times. When we have hybrids, a lot of times the more different the species are becoming from each other, their offspring would be sterile. So if you look at this one, we've got our donkey and our horse. And when they come together, they make this great work animal called a mule. But the mule are sterile, and they can't have any offspring of their own, preventing them from becoming a successful species. And then finally, we have hybrid breakdown in this situation. The first ones, the first hybrids might be good. They might be successful and fertile and fruitful, but then their offspring, as we go through future generations, become less successful and end up becoming sterile over time, and they die. Wah, wah, wah. So this whole species complex or concept can be applied to fossils, to asexual organisms, to anything, but it doesn't work so well in the absence of gene flow. Gene flow can occur between distant species, because if you had something like a grizzly bear and a polar bear, they make growler bears. Really? Pizzly bears, I think, would sound better. What do you guys think? Growler bear or pizzly bear? Pizzly sounds awesome. Anyway, here is the grizzly bear. Here is the polar bear, and their hybrid is a growler bear. So in this situation, we're still having hybrids being born because of the gene flow. And if you look there, is that growler bear going to be real great up in the Arctic or down in the forested regions? Not so much. Poor growler bear. We really got to write somebody. That's terrible. All right, so when we have species happening, speciation happening, it can happen with or without geographic isolation. And geographic isolation means just what it sounds like. Geographic is talking about some sort of land, right? And separation, some sort of land or some sort of physical feature is going to separate two species. So in our first scenario here, we have allopatric speciation. Allopatric speciation is when we are going to have a separation of some physical barrier. This is causing allopatric speciation is resulting in a geographic isolation. We are actually separating these two species. Now it's easy to understand why these two have become separated from each other, because they have a mass that is actually preventing them from interacting. But over here in sympatric speciation, that land mass is not separating them anymore. But there's going to be some sort of trait, perhaps the color itself is going to cause problems and keep them from interbreeding. All right, sorry, people keep interrupting me. It's very hard to do this stuff at home. So as I told you, gene flow is interrupted or reduced because they were geographically isolated. You could also think of the Galapagos Island birds and turtles, same situation. They were on separate islands, so of course the gene flow has been interrupted. You could have a canyon, you could have a river, it depends on the situation, but any of those would cause a barrier. Here's another situation where predation was the barrier that prevented or that made these things change over time. If they had high predation, then they were a thicker, stronger fish with a thicker body and a stronger tail and the ability to really swim away from predators. And that's the kind of fish that was successful when a lot of predators were around. But under low predation, they kind of thinned out, got a little limpier, a little skinnier, and that resulted in a whole bunch of these little skinny fish. And over time, depending on whether or not the predator was there, the population would change. So we have lots of examples of allopatric speciation. I just told you about the Galapagos. We told you about the salamanders. They also did a study on some shrimp that lived right down here in the isthmus, I don't even know how to say that, of Panama, that little land bridge that connects North and South America. And these guys all used to be the same species. All these little, they were, ooh, hi, back here. These were all related to each other. They were all the same species at one point, but when this land mass emerged, when the water levels went down so that the land was present, they were separated from each other, and over time, they haven't been able to intermix, and they have formed different species. In sympatric speciation, this is when you've got overlapping populations. They should be able to mate. They are actually in the same area. They don't have anything blocking them from each other, but they still end up causing different species to occur. Sexual selection can be an example of this. You guys all know that different animals, birds and fish, are really big examples of this. They have color patterns that allow for them to attract a mate. Here you've got nice little fish in different colors, and you can see in normal light versus in a orange light, they look kind of different from each other. When they had a change in the murkiness of the water, the P. nairiri was able to stand out more, attract more mates, and it caused a separation of them, but only in the normal light. If you look here in the monochromatic orange light, like if the water had gotten really, really polluted and you couldn't have that light come in very well, then it wouldn't really matter which kind of coloration pattern you had, because you ended up looking exactly the same. Habitat differentiation is another one. If organisms like that snake back in the beginning, the garter snake, if they end up going into a different area, then they might not interbreed anymore. The North American maggot fly lives on hawthorn trees and also apple trees. So here it's feeding on a hawthorn berry. And over time, as they started to be able to survive on the apple tree as well, they could go back and forth between these two, but this particular species stayed on the hawthorn berry and the other stayed on the apple tree. So even though they're in the same area, they decided they liked different foods and eventually became different species. So allopathic speciation, allopatric speciation, you have geographic isolation. You have something separating the two. But reproductive isolation could be from any of those things. Could be physical abnormalities, physical differences, could be time of year, could be time of day, could be the behavior patterns. Any of these can separate organisms enough to create two totally different species. And this is not something that happens in general very quickly. Usually, like as those salamanders were moving down the whole state of California, they were slowly changing from each other, and you ended up with two different species. There's always been a question, is it something that's very slow and you're slowly changing over time, Or is it something that happens quickly? Like all of a sudden, some random crazy mutation occurred. They've used the fossil record, morphological data, molecular data, all to try to understand how this occurs. There are a few people, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, they like an idea called punctuated equilibria. What this means is that some sudden change happened, and then everything was steady for a while, and then some sudden change. Should be like if humans, all of a sudden, there were humans born with green skin. And then we went on for a while with white skin and brown skin and darker brown skin and green skin. And then all of a sudden, in another 100 million years, blue skin came out. It would be just sudden changes and then long periods with no change whatsoever. Darwin was more along the idea of liking the gradual model. He liked the idea that things changed a little bit over time, and as they continue to get different, more and more different from each other, then they ended up as different species. So people still argue for both of these models. Probably maybe both of them happen over time. That is how we got the sunflower, punctuated equilibrium. Ended up getting our beautiful sunflower from the hybridization of 2 other sunflower species. So if we had never had that hybridization happen, we would never have had our beautiful sunflowers that we love to look at and take pictures of. It all came from the combination of these genes, 2 different species, but similar enough that they could still reproduce and create this hybrid, and that is how we got our sunflower. Yay. Sometimes speciation can happen over just a few thousand years. Sometimes it takes millions of years. But every time it happens, it gives us diversity and makes us potentially best fit for our environment. And that is all we're going to do for today. For this chapter, I'm going to give you a mastering biology because it's really kind of hard to do anything else with this chapter at home. Hopefully this is all going to end soon. I know you guys miss coming to school and learning, and oh, I miss you. I hope that you guys have a delightful day. Come in and see me at 11:30 tomorrow if you want to meet and talk about anything. Have a great night. Talk to you later.